Now, the other technical concepts that they ask in product companies, the next part that I'm going to tell you would be a separate interview in itself. In service companies, typically you just have one interview, so you'll have 5-10 minutes of Hey everyone, let's discuss technical interviews today. I'm getting a lot of questions on technical interviews, specifically for freshers, like what are the questions that will be asked, what are the topics you need to revise, what are the important topics, how the interviews will be conducted, and so on. So this is more of a freewheeling conversation. I'll tell you all of the experiences we've had in the last 4 or 5 years running Edyst, where we've got more than 10,000 students placed into different companies and guided them with technical interviews in different kinds of companies, both in services companies as well as product-based companies. All right. So if you don't know the difference between service and product-based companies, you can check out some other videos for that. But let's just dive deeper into this whole thing of technical interviews. Right. So technical interviews are generally done after your coding round. If you are going to take all of the rounds that are there in an interview, there are typically speaking about 3 to 4 rounds depending on the company you're going for. So let's say, for example, the first round is usually a coding round. This could be a coding contest, like in services companies you have your TCS NQT National Qualifier Test, or TCS Code Vita, or Infosys has InfiTQ or Hack with Infi. So like that, you may have given some kind of a test. If it's an on-campus placement, then you may have given a coding round over there. Sometimes there are also aptitude questions over there. This is called the written round. We are not going to talk about that today. Our major focus today is about technical interviews, which is usually the second round after your written round. So let's get into it. So in your technical interviews, typically the interviewer wants to know 2-3 things. First thing is the written round that you have written. Are you actually aware of all the concepts that you've implemented over there? So let's say it's a coding round that you had earlier. They want to know that the coding question that you have written, the answer you have written, whether you are able to explain it or not. And this is why when we are teaching coding to students, we always make sure to tell you that don't just get the solution, but get the logic. And when you're talking to your friends, always try to explain the logic to them. Can be in your local language also. It need not be actually in English with your friends. But make sure you are getting in the habit of explaining the logic one by one, line by line. Because what happens is when you go to the interview, you end up talking about the code. Sir, first I wrote for loop, then I wrote while loop, then I wrote if condition. The interviewer can already read all of that stuff. What they're asking for is, can you explain your code? Can you talk about your code so that when you join our team and I ask you to explain what you have written, you can explain in plain English what you've actually written, the logic that you've written. So this is a major part of technical interviews. That is, they will either take your written round code and ask you to explain that, or they will give you a new code. Let's say if you are going for a services company, it's going to be something as simple as Fibonacci series or factorial. So they'll ask you to write that code and they'll ask you to explain that code. When I say write that code, it could be on pen and paper, or if it's online, then they could just share a small window with you and you start writing the code over there. And then they'll ask you to explain that. Now the language, the programming language does not matter so much here. You can write it in C, C++, Java, Python, whichever. But the interviewer is more looking for, are you able to explain these concepts properly or not? For example, if you are going to write the code for factorial, I'm hoping that most of you are aware of the code for factorial. Instead of saying, sir, I will write a for loop and then I'll calculate the product. Instead of that, you say that I'll start with the number 1. I'll incrementally go from 1 to the n whose factorial I want to find. And as I'm going through each number, I keep multiplying that into my product. And finally, I'll print the product. For example, I'll take 1, then I'll take 2, multiply by 1, it becomes 2. Then I'll multiply 3 into the previous product, which is 3 into 2, 6. Then I'll take 4, multiply into my previous product, which is 4 into 6, 24, and so on. So now when you explain like this, it doesn't matter if you did it in C, C++, Java, or Python. The logic remains same throughout for all of the coding questions. So this is one major component of your technical interviews. They are going to ask you about explaining your coding question, be that in the written round, or they would have given you a new coding question in the interview itself. So that's one. But it's not only this. So if you've just been doing coding practice, let's say competitive programming practice, or just data structure algorithms practice, it's not just related to this. They will ask you more questions also. Just a side note here, for product companies, you will not get such an easy question as factorial. You will get more difficult questions, and it's always dependent on how you're able to solve that in optimal time. So one strategy to follow is show the answer that you think is the right answer, but you don't need to optimize it, and slowly you keep talking to the interviewer and keep optimizing that approach. So probably you started with an order n square approach, then the interviewer says, okay, can we do better? Then you go to an order n log n, then an order n, and if the question has an even more optimal solution, you can go even further over there. So for product companies, the coding explanation is longer than this. For service companies, typically 5-10 minutes is just gone in the code question explanation. In product companies, sometimes the entire round can be taken by one such question. Now, the other technical concepts that they ask in product companies, the next part that I'm going to tell you would be a separate interview in itself. In service companies, typically you just have one interview. So you'll have 5-10 minutes of technical coding question. That was the coding question part, explanation of that. And then you'll go into technical concepts. These are concepts generally related to your syllabus, your college engineering syllabus. These will be things like object-oriented programming, data structures, databases, and OS and networking, depending on the company. Some companies don't ask that much of OS, operating systems, and networking. Some companies do ask that. Very famous among most interviewers is data structures. Like there are a lot of interview questions that are geared specifically for data structures, like using stacks, queues, linked lists. These questions don't appear in coding round, but they appear most often in technical interviews. For example, given two stacks, or rather given one stack, generate another stack which is the reverse of the first stack. Now doing this using coding is fairly straightforward, but when you're in an interview, the interviewer will put up some specific conditions, like you can't use another stack, or you can't use another queue, or you can't use another array, right? And so based on those restrictions, you have to then answer the interviewer and change your approach over there. So data structures has a bunch of these questions. Do check out some of our other videos where we'll talk about that. So data structures has some of these interesting interview questions. Object-oriented programming is full of such interview questions. Your typical polymorphism, abstraction, encapsulation, and inheritance. All of these form a lot of questions in object-oriented programming. Very specifically here, they will go language specific, meaning that if you are someone who's comfortable in Python, you could explain OOP using Python. If you're someone who's comfortable in Java, you do that in Java, or C++, the same thing. This is where C students generally have a disadvantage, because as a C student, you don't really get that much object-oriented programming in your language because there is not many features of that. So make sure you are in an object-oriented programming language, an OOP language, so that you can actually answer these questions. Now, if you are a non-CSE student, this is mainly the level of questions that you're going to be getting. Now, since most of you are CSE students these days, especially with the new branches and so on, then you definitely need to know your databases and your OS and networking as well, but databases definitely. So there's no excuse for not knowing basics of SQL. You definitely need to know the basics of SQL for sure, and some DBMS concepts as well. These all are typically what you will get asked in your technical interviews, and for services companies, this is more than sufficient. Another thing, the last thing that is super important in technical interviews is projects. Now, if you have a good project, this can take up as much as 30 to 40 minutes of your technical interview time. In many product companies, there is one round dedicated just to your project. Now, this project could be a project you've done in your college as a research project. It could be something you've done in an internship. It could be something you've done on your own completely as an open source thing. It's completely fine. What needs to be there in the project is depth. Means you can't just have a project which can be assembled in 2 days. If it's that simple, then the explanation will also not have too many details. The project needs to have a lot of details in it. For example, if you're just creating a web app that tells you the weather, right? It's going to rain tomorrow or not going to rain tomorrow and so on. That's a very simple application. It's a good application to create for your learning, but it'll take about 2 days for you to create, or even 3 hours for you to create. Talking about that in an interview is not going to set you apart from others. However, if you create a proper web application with, let's say, a clone of Zomato or a clone of Airbnb, if you've not heard of Airbnb, please do check them out. But if you create a clone of something like that with login, log out features, with going through a bunch of listings, being able to comment on listings, being able to purchase some things, even if a dummy purchase. If you are able to create such an application, then this requires you to create front end, create back end, create database, and if you're able to deploy it, that is actually run it online, that is you deploy it to the cloud, that's great. Now you have all 4-5 of the skills that are required to become a full stack web developer, and you can actually talk about that in an interview. And it's not just full stack web development, you can do the same thing with data science, AI, machine learning, blockchain, that's up to you. But the point is, if you create a project that is done in 2 to 3 hours or in 2 days, it's not really going to work that well in an interview setting. Meaning that you might still be able to answer some questions, but it's not going to set you apart. However, if you create something that took a month for you itself to develop, then you will have that much more to talk about in your interviews. So just summarizing the entire thing, in your technical interviews, you're going to get coding questions, be that the one you've done in your written round or the one you are given in the interview. That's one. You'll have your core curriculum knowledge, that is things like object-oriented programming, data structures, databases, OS, networking, and also I forgot to mention things like multi-threading, exception handling, and so on. Anything that is not going to be asked in your coding round but still in your syllabus is possible to be asked in the technical interviews. And finally, technical projects, that is the project that you have done. And if you don't have any project, please make sure to go and at least do some free project, something, because some project is better than no project. So make sure that you've done some project out there. If you've done an internship, then your internship experience can also count as your project. But the point is, the interviewer should have something to discuss with you which is based in real life application. So those are the important topics for technical interviews. Do subscribe to this channel. We will cover each of these topics in depth in the coming few days, but make sure you subscribe to this channel for that. Let me know in the comments below what other kind of experiences you would like us to share, and we will make videos on that as well. Thanks a lot for watching, everybody. Do share with your friends who are appearing for technical interviews, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you so much.